Hello everybody, my name is Stephen Haas and welcome to the National Paralegal College analysis of a recent case. And today we've got a case for you called Molina Martinez versus the United States. This was a recent United States Supreme Court case that just came down actually a couple of weeks ago. Today is May 5th and this came down on April 20th. And this case came down on certiorari to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That means it was originally appealed to the Fifth Circuit, coming out of the states of either Texas, Louisiana, or Mississippi, which the Fifth Circuit encompasses, and then it went up to the United States Supreme Court. And this case involved an issue that's relevant to the United States sentencing guidelines. The sentencing guidelines are in force in all federal courts around the country. Federal district judges use them to determine sentences in federal cases, and they are written by a federal agency called the United States Sentencing Commission, which again writes and maintains, updates at least once a year, the Guidelines Manual, which is sometimes known as the United States Sentencing Guidelines. The purpose of the guidelines is uniformity. The idea is that all federal crimes should be punished approximately to the same degree, no matter where you are in the country. After a person is convicted, the United States Probation Office is assigned the task of writing what's called a PSR, or a pre-sentencing memorandum, which tells the judge what the conviction was and kind of goes through the background of what the criminal history category is, what the appropriate level of sentencing for that particular category is. The judge doesn't have to listen to everything in the PSR. The judge obviously has to use his or her own discretion, but that's what the judge uses as a starting point. Once the judge, using the PSR, determines the level of crime that is applicable over here and the criminal history category of the defendant, the judge then uses the sentencing table, which is published as part of the sentencing guidelines, to make a determination as to what the sentence should be. Levels start all the way at 1 and go all the way up to 43, with a 43 level being punishable by life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and a 1, as you can see, only being punishable by 0 to 6 months in prison. So there's quite a bit of disparity between them. Now, the levels are determined by a long, complex series of rules that apply base levels for all crimes and then increase or decrease them based on their characteristics. First degree murder, for example, is a 43, whereas second degree murder starts out as a 38 and then can go up or down, but it's still pretty high. Theft, starts off as a 6 and then can get higher and higher depending on how much money was stolen and various other characteristics. Once the judge makes the determination of what level is to be applicable and the criminal history category of the defendant, the judge then uses this grid to make a determination as to what the sentencing range should be. This is, of course, in months. So, for example, a 15 in a criminal history category of 2 would be between 21 and 27 months imprisonment. And what's going to be key in our case is that the judge has the discretion to make a determination in terms of where in this guideline the sentence should be. So, for example, if we're looking at 30 to 37 months, the judge can say 30, the judge can say 31, the judge can say 36, the judge can say 37. The judge does have that complete discretion. Now, the judge also technically has discretion to go outside the sentencing table for various reasons, or even for no reason at all, as the Supreme Court ruled in some cases. Again, we're not going to get into that. That's a very complex issue. But judges typically do use the sentencing table and will explain themselves very well if they decide to go outside of the table for whatever reason. Now, what had happened in this case is the district court had made a mistake in determining the sentence level for the defendant in this case, whose name was Saul Molina Martinez. The probation office had advised, and the judge had agreed, and turned out to be correct, that the offense level was 21. Now, for an offense level of 21, we'd have to look at this line in the sentencing guidelines. And the judge in the pre-sentencing report had thought that the criminal history category of the defendant ought to have been a 6, when it really, if you read it carefully, which was discovered later on, should have been a 5. Now, a 6 had the range of 77 to 96 months, whereas a 5, and a 21 level, had a range of 70 to 87 months. And in fact, Mr. Molina Martinez was sentenced to 77 months based on a criminal history category of 6, which was mistaken, and an offense level of 21. Now, as you can see, that is the minimum sentence in that range. Whereas, had the correct range been used, 77 months still would have been within the range, because the range is 70 to 87, but it wouldn't have been at the low end. The low end would have been 70 months. So the question here is Mr. Molina Martinez entitled to a new sentencing based on the fact that even though the 77 months would have been in the range anyway, a mistake was made as to what the range ought to have been. Well, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the appellate court in this case, applied a rule they called the additional evidence rule, which says that as long as the sentence was within what would have normally been the correct range, which the 77 months was, the defendant has to identify additional evidence to show that the use of the incorrect guidelines actually mattered. Now, the Supreme Court noted that other courts of appeals didn't see it that way. Most other courts of appeals in the Federal Circuit have not adapted so rigid a standard. Instead, what they've done is they've concluded that a district court's application of an incorrect guideline range can itself serve as evidence of an effect on substantial rights, in other words, that there should be a new sentencing. And what the Supreme Court very often did, as it very often does, is it grants certiorari, in other words, agrees to hear a case in order to resolve a conflict in the circuits. If two circuits disagree with each other, the Supreme Court will say, okay, we have to make a determination as to which one is correct. And the Supreme Court ultimately disagreed with the Fifth Circuit and bounced it back down to the Fifth Circuit for resentencing, or really the District Court for resentencing. First of all, the Supreme Court acknowledged the fact that the guidelines are really the basis, are a very important basis that's used by the district courts in sentencing. The court cited other cases to say that federal courts understand that they must begin their analysis with the guidelines and remain cognizant of them throughout, and in fact that the guidelines are in a real sense the basis for every sentence. Having established the importance of the guidelines, the Supreme Court then further commented, the effect that the guidelines have on sentencing is so pervasive and consistent throughout the country. And that district courts, as a matter of course, use the guidelines range to instruct them regarding the appropriate balance of various sentencing factors. Federal sentencing guidelines are very complex. I used to work at the U.S. Attorney's Office and had a chance to see them up close, and there were many, many different factors that they keep in mind. So the judge, rather than worrying about the ins and outs of every single case, the idea is that the judge should simply be able to say, oh, well, the writers of the guidelines looked at these factors and made these determinations, so I'm just going to trust their judgment. And then the court looked furthermore at the facts of this particular case. And the court said the 77-month sentence actually given was conspicuous because it was the lowest sentence within the range. Remember, the judge thought that as a criminal history category of 6 and a level of 21, the range would have been 77 to 96 months, and the judge actually gave the defendant that lower end 77 month. So based on that idea, that the judge evinced an intention to give the minimum recommended by the guidelines, it's very possible that if the judge had correctly surmised the criminal history category of 5 and the range as starting at 70 months, maybe the judge would have given the defendant only 70 months, and therefore the U.S. Supreme Court said to leave it at 77 based on this idea that, well, you have to show some kind of real evidence that it mattered would not be fair. And the Supreme Court agreed with the other circuits and said that the Fifth Circuit rule that you have to establish additional evidence if the guidelines were improperly applied was not what the Supreme Court was going to adopt. Instead, the Supreme Court said that essentially, in the event that you can show that the guidelines were incorrectly applied, it's up to the district court to make a determination under the new appropriate guidelines, and Mr. Molina Martinez is entitled to a new sentencing. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for listening as well. This is Stephen Haas for National Paralegal College. Have a wonderful day, everybody.